No human being deserved such a fate. What happened to them was not just cruelty. What happened was dark enough to rot even the souls, cold enough to make the ice cold. It's called a meat grinder. Millions of people got their share from it. It's not just the stories of an old age. Not too long ago, Siberia was at the very center of the Soviet Union. I'm here to tell you what happened in the middle of GULAG. Hellish History, 1918. The conflicts between the Tsarist Russian administration and the Bolshevik rebels ended, and eventually the Soviet Union, which had a socialist ideology, was established under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin. But it is not easy to maintain order in this newly established huge country, so Lenin forced labor camps began to be established upon the instructions of. The main purpose of these labor camps, called GULAG for short, was to isolate and re-educate the socially dangerous, subversive elements, in Lenin's words, whose ideas did not serve the new order. Moreover, it was to provide the workforce the country needed, but when Stalin came to power, especially between the 1930s and 1952, the gulags turned into a terrible system and turned into the most brutal labor camps in human history. So much so that the number of camps, which were a few dozen, spread throughout the entire Soviet Union geography, including 53 directorates and 423 labor colonies, along with Stalin. The regime of foreign spies in the country, it was now very easy to end up in the GULAG labor camps due to the fear of destruction, as well as Stalin's oppressive management and suspicious attitude. A little joke you made about any manager could cause your opposition to emerge, or a piece of bread you had to steal due to hunger would cause you to spend most of your life in this situation. It was a sufficient reason. The definition of counter-revolutionary action in Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code, dated February 25, 1927, was the most frequently used law regarding political criminals. For example, during the period called the Great Terror, customers sitting in a restaurant in Odessa smiled sympathetically, while the drunk soldiers around them were telling anti-Soviet jokes. As a matter of fact, between 1918 and 1957, when the camps were closed, between 15 and 18 million prisoners were forced to work in these camps, and about 2 million of them died. If you fell into the gulag, no one will pity you anymore. They just say you are a prisoner. Do not wait for another explanation. There will be a knock on your door, and sometimes a car will arrive. Sometimes the journey in the middle of Siberia was carried out in cages in a train. Afterwards, reaching the camp was completed with old transportation vehicles pulled by animals. When the camp or interrogation center was reached, the torture started during the interrogation before the punishment was even determined. For example, a method called amov heating, there was both cold and disgusting smelly air being given to the cell, and in the mushroom room, the inside was extremely heated. According to Vasil Alexandrova, they heated these cells so much that blood began to flow from the pores of the body. The guards watching inside the door hole would not take the prisoner out without seeing this blood. There were people who were thrown into the sewer pool in the dark, sonic torture. There were also cases where the prisoner, who was seated 67 meters away, was forced to speak and repeat loudly for hours, a terrifying practice for someone who was already physically exhausted. Sometimes, a pipe was made from paper and held to both ears of the prisoner, and an extremely bright light was shone into the cell painted in the same color as the shout, as a result of which the prisoner's eyelids would become inflamed. Depriving them of sleep was also torture. There was no visible trace of the boat. No matter how bad the wards were, they looked like heaven from the cells. Prisoners who were locked in unheated cells in the cold of Siberia were also left hungry for days. In such cases, you feel like you can't stand for an hour, but days later. GULAG labor camps were mostly set up in remote parts of the country. Some camps were thousands of kilometers away from the nearest settlement, and in the cold of Siberia, the air temperature was minus 60 degrees. The prisoners were employed in fields such as timber production, mining, railway construction, and ammunition production. Common criminals, gangsters called legal thieves, and dissidents called class enemies by the state. It was not important that the crimes of the majority of the prisoners were confirmed. A notice, any suspicion, was enough to be imprisoned in these camps for between 5 and 25 years. Age or gender did not matter. For example, children who had committed theft. The sentence was between 10 and 25 years, and the possibility of reducing the sentence was eliminated due to the law dated November 25, 1935, within the scope of the prevention of juvenile delinquency, homelessness, and neglect. While women were initially placed in the same camps as men, they were isolated in the late periods. Those who enter here are not only their bodies, but also their human dignity, and photographs of their loved ones are allowed. As a matter of fact, in the report of a camp administrator, the working order in the camp is described as, there are cases where a prisoner is given only 4 or 5 hours out of 24 for rest. This significantly reduces his productivity. In addition to working hours, food shortage is another problem, because by law, prisoners have to work during the day. In 1938, during the Great Purge, Andrei Visky, the Prosecutor General of the Soviet Union, wrote a memorandum to the head of the GULAG and stated that among the prisoners there are those who are so ragged and lice-infested that they pose a health hazard to those left behind. It has deteriorated to the point that they have lost their resemblance to humans. Some say Jesus is a mouse. Barl Shamalov, a former prisoner, describes those days as follows: I was ready to cry because I was afraid that the soup would turn completely into water. We would eat it slowly, but if you have an empty stomach, even if the soup enters it, you will feel incredible pain. We were crying when we were hungry. But when we ate something, we were still crying because our stomachs were worse. But few camps were as scary as the ones in Vorkuta. Nearly 2 million prisoners came and went from the coal mines of the region, which is approximately 160 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle and 1,900 kilometers away from Moscow, about 200,000 of them from cold, disease, and hunger. He died in the corrective special labor camp number 6 here in 1936. Supporters of the Marxist revolutionary Lev Trocki were detained and started a mass strike. The prisoners who participated in the strike, which continued for 132 days, demanded that politicians be separated from criminals, an 8-hour working day. Special meals were given to politicians, and food was provided regardless of work performance. In the program prepared by the Gulag administration, it was announced that the demands of the prisoners striking in the Vuga mines would be met. The prisoners had won a victory, but in a very short time after the strike was won, the majority of the participants were executed. Those who planned to escape from the camps in the remote areas of the Soviets were asked to come with them against the risk of dying of hunger. He would try to persuade the weak and new prisoners. These people were called canned. Do not compare Siberia to any other place. Especially in those years, in freezing weather conditions, you may have to walk for months without seeing a single settlement. For this reason, the prisoners' escape was sometimes turned a blind eye. Let them go. Let's see where they would go for a prisoner. Escaping or even being released is not exactly a salvation, because even the families of these people were separated from society, especially if the relatives left behind by political criminals were considered social outcasts. Because they were called the brother of the class enemy and the friend of the class enemy. For this reason, a special unit was established to catch those who escaped from the camp in the Yakut region. When they came back, they did not have any fugitives. However, they brought their ears and received 3 rubles per person. September 1st, 1939 World War I begins. During the war years, Gulag prisoners began to be ignored. Almost one-third of the production mechanism of the Soviet Union was carried out by Gulag prisoners. For example, Stalin and Magadan were entirely made by Gulag. These are cities that emerged as cities, but since the priority of the state during the war years was the condition of the soldiers at the front, the food of the prisoners was reduced and increased. Operation Barbarossa, which was the largest military operation in human history and started by Adolf Hitler, included 4.5 million soldiers on the Nazi side, 3,200 tanks, 4,389 aircraft, and nearly 5 million on the Soviet Union side. Soldiers, 11,000 more tanks, 9,100 aircraft were on the front. On such a terrible front, the Soviets did not have any resources for Gulag prisoners. Gulag camps on the front line were mobilized every minute of the day to meet the needs of the army. The speed of German advance on Soviet territory also slowed down the evacuation of the camps in the war zone. This put labor in the hands of the Germans. Of course, not all camps were under such bad conditions. Sometimes incentives were also applied. In this case, in order to increase efficiency, penalty reductions for those who are productive, the right to buy newspapers, and the privilege of sports competitions within the camp were opened. Of course, this was only valid for certain camps. In 1949, the Soviet Union had become a nuclear power. 100% of the engineers and skilled workers working in nuclear facilities were prisoners of war, and they were given the same food rights as the free ones. They were treated more humanely, but after all, they were also imprisoned. The situation of women was the worst. Even women who committed theft as deplorably as bad prisoners, or even women who worked voluntarily in the church, were taken to Gulag camps. Being the wife of a political prisoner was enough to be arrested. We see the most important example of this in Alger, the camp for traitor wives in Kazakhstan. One of the women serving their sentences in the Alger camp is Maria Danilenko, stated the Katak consists mostly of educated women, such as professors, artists, educators, engineers, and scientists. Soviet film actress Rachel Mezer, writer Yuri Trifonov's mother, Yevgenia Luria Trifonova, female writer Galina Saka, actress Tatiana Akunev are just some of the famous women imprisoned in the Alger camp. The barracks in the camp, the dining hall, the animal pens, the water tank. The granary workshops were built by the hands of intellectual women who had never done hard labor in their lives. This camp hosted such great massacres and torture that I don't even want to explain it in the video. Women sleeping in the freezing wards had to sleep with hats to prevent their hair from sticking to the walls. During the disguise period, thanks to the bread that the surrounding Kazakh shepherds put under the bushes. These women managed to survive. They worked with primitive tools, they lived in poorly heated, dirty places, and had to make do with little food. However, unlike men, women managed to survive thanks to the solid friendships they established by sharing food and clothing, providing emotional support to each other, and were more resistant to side diseases. Former prisoner Aldik describes women as follows: while working, the body is melting. Everything that belongs to womanhood in a woman is disappearing. Her age is not visible. Her shoulders are pointed upwards. Her breasts are dried sacks of buttocks. The skin is in folds. The flesh on her knees has melted. Her legs have become thin enough for a sheep's head and a ball to pass through. Her voice has become thick. And it was turned down, you know, at the beginning of the video. You saw an article saying, "Those who have not yet come will definitely come, and those who have come will never forget." This article was hanging in the Alger camp. Today, there is the Alger camp in Kazakhstan. In other words, the Gate of Sorrow Museum. And the pain experienced is exhibited to the world. The date is March 5th, 1953, and Stalin dies. His death, albeit slowly, was the beginning of the end of the Gulag oppression. In the same year, an amnesty was issued, covering those who were imprisoned for minor crimes, but not politicians. After Stalin's death, Nikita Kev, who took over the position of first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on September 7, 1953, reviewed 4 million political cases of the period, was carried out, and most of them were found to be innocent. 4 million political cases. Gulak incident. In 1957, the process of dismantling the camps was started. But some prisoners did not want to leave the camps. They had spent most of their lives here, and they said that they felt alienated from the families they left behind, their children, and even their grandchildren they had never seen. During the new governments, many former Gulag prisoners' various rehabilitation efforts were initiated to reintegrate them into society. In fact, the main purpose of the Gulag camps was not to kill or destroy, as I mentioned at the beginning, to rehabilitate the dissidents and to use criminals as labor force. It was also seen that there was no killing order in the Soviet archives, which were opened for research years later, but when necessary, the camp authorities were notified. Rights were given for this. Moreover, most of the deaths were due to hunger, disease, cold, and attempts to escape. So much so that the biggest fear of the relatives of the prisoners was the people who were said to have been released and were never heard from again. Everyone knew that they were dead. Today, there are also those who say that what is happening in the ears is fake. However, the archives that are open for viewing statements of former Soviet administrators, memoirs of tens of thousands of prisoners, reveal much more than what I have explained here. Those who wonder whether prison conditions can be this bad can look at the conditions of prisons in Russia, even today. Those who question the reality of the Gulag can examine the museums in the former Soviet countries that have gained independence. The darkness of the night is as real as it is in the Gulag camps. What happened is that real. Unfortunately, it's real.